Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to do a little video about broken tuners on classical guitars. I got a question about this a few days ago in my YouTube comments, and I thought it might be worth a video. The question that I got was basically, how do I find tuners that are going to fit my guitar? So I'll tell you here what I told this person in my comments, which is that classical guitars generally have kind of an industry standard with the spacing and sizing of their tuners. It isn't to say that you won't find exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, if you have tuners that look something like this, you'll be able to replace them with something that looks like this pretty easily, and it's not going to take a whole lot of measuring and stuff. You can pretty much just order a classical guitar tuner, and most of the time it will fit. Cases where you'll run into exceptions oftentimes are really cheap guitars, things that may have come from some sweatshop somewhere, in which case you may be seeing some kind of thing that they threw together themselves. I have encountered that once or twice. Generally when you see that, like, the tuners themselves look extremely cheap too, and generally speaking the guitar isn't really worth a whole lot of work, and so I don't think that's going to be necessarily a situation that a lot of people encounter. And the other situation would be in extremely high-end guitars, where you may be dealing with something a little bit different. But even on high-end guitars, usually this industry standard sizing is what you're going to be looking at. Let's talk about how these tuners break. So you're obviously seeing this crack here and this crack here. This is a really common thing to have happen on guitars as they age. This plastic will shrink and it will shatter because there's a hard metal post in the middle, and as that plastic shrinks around that metal post, creates a lot of tension, and a lot of times it'll just kind of bust off like that. And in some cases the plastic just gets kind of old and brittle and starts cracking. So that's a pretty common thing to see. Another common thing is that on these tuners, when you have these plastic buttons, is a lot of times the plastic buttons will end up kind of shattering off at some point, just pretty much for the same reasons that the tuning posts will, just in that it's plastic, it's around a hard piece of metal, and it gets old. Plastic just doesn't age very well. Some other instances, you may find something that has missing parts, so like one of these little screws out of the spur gear may go missing, or you may be missing a worm gear. Things like that will happen with these guys. So I guess I'll go ahead and just kind of walk you through replacing these. These are some cheap tuners that in cases like this where I'm dealing with a guitar that's like not super high end, I have found these to be really great. These are Alice branded tuners. You can find them on eBay for pretty cheap, and they're not maybe like the best piece of hardware, but these are pretty good, and they're oftentimes a step up from what you're taking off. And I guess I'll talk about kind of the differences and what I'm seeing here, and on versus what we're seeing on these stock tuners. The first is that if you look at the top of these tuners here that are on the guitar, you'll see that the worm gear is held in by kind of a lobe with a hook on it. So it doesn't actually go all the way around that worm gear. It just kind of hooks in and is held there by the spur gear. And that's the kind of arrangement that you'll encounter a lot on cheaper guitars, cheaper tuners, especially like old Yamahas, things like that from the 70s. They mostly have something that looks kind of like this. The difference is that on here, the lobe actually does go all the way around on both sides, so down here below and above. So that's completely captured by that lobe. And the reason that that's important is just because it creates a kind of tuning stability. These tend to bend a lot less and tend to develop a lot less stiffness over time. They're just generally more solid. These tend not to fall apart in quite the same way that these do. Something else that you'll notice as well, if you look real carefully, let me see if I can get the camera to zoom in. you see that this is all just metal on metal here. And this is the type of thing that requires occasional maintenance. So occasionally you'll have to come in here and drop a little bit of oil or grease on this in order to keep it moving, because that unfortunately is just kind of a bearing surface that's not particularly smooth and not very good at being a bearing surface. Versus these guys here, where there's actually a nylon bushing down here at the bottom, and I'm going to guess that there's probably some kind of cool thing happening up here too, because these just move like butter. And you know, typically when you see one of these like self-lubricating plastics in there, what it means is that, you know, for as long as that plastic is intact and working, that this is going to function fairly well with very little lubrication. Now, that being said, eventually that little you know, bushing is going to get old and it's going to fall out of there, but that's going to be, you know, years down the line. At that point, we replace this with something else. You know, maybe the guitar won't even live that long. So, well, I guess I'll talk about some other things that I like about these tuners versus the ones that are on here. One thing that you may notice is that the tuning button on here is just a little bit bigger on these guys, and for classical guitars that's actually kind of a big deal. For you steel string players out there, you may not realize this, but with nylon string guitars you really do have to sit there and like tediously wind these strings. If you have a string winder, it's kind of awkward to get the string winder on there and use that to wind the strings. I mean, that's how we all do it, but I mean, it's more awkward to do it on one of these guys than it is on a steel string, and there's a lot more windings that need to happen on those posts in order for it to work. So yeah. So yeah, these I think they look pretty good and they work well. There are definitely higher end tuners that you can get for guitars, but I've had really good luck with these, and this is what I have on my own classical guitar back home. I got them originally for mine first because I wanted to see how they work, and I've had good luck with it. So anyway, we'll go ahead and talk about removing these guys. So generally there's some little screws that are holding these on. These screws aren't structural. And so, you know, once in a while you'll encounter one that's kind of loose, and that's okay. You know, they can be loose. If they are loose, what you can do is you can use the toothpick trick, which is to break the little tip off of a toothpick and put it down and drop it down into that hole, and then just slip the screw in alongside it. You don't have to use any glue or anything. You just it holds it in kind of by tension, sort of the same way like a drywall anchor works. Though you definitely can, you know, dowel and re-glue these and do that too. These aren't meant to come out that often, and so, you know, this would be a good place to use that toothpick solution, just because you aren't going in and, you know, taking these off and on all the time. And so when these crack like this, a lot of times you'll meet a lot of resistance when you go to pull these out. And what you want to do is just kind of hold the guitar down firmly against your workbench and just kind of walk it out and see if you can. What you may have to do in really worst case scenarios is when you encounter something maybe that isn't completely broken off, you may have to get in there with like a flathead screwdriver and kind of forcibly break that piece off. And that way you can actually, you know, slip it out, because whatever you do, it's got to be smaller, or capable of being smaller than one of these holes that you're drawing it out of, obviously. But yeah, that's kind of how you do that. And we'll go ahead and we'll put the new tuner on. Now, as far as orientation goes, you want to make sure that the spur gear is towards the guitar body, and that the worm gear is away from the guitar body. And the reason for that is that as this pulls, as the string pressure pulls this post this way, it's going to be pushing the spur gear into the worm gear, versus if we had it mounted this way, where the string pressure pulling on this thing would actually be pulling the spur gear away from the worm gear. And yeah, that's pretty important just for the longevity of the tuner, and we've seen, especially with old Gibson mandolins, that like over time that can actually create quite a lot of problems mounting the tuners the other way, and so that's why we don't do it. That's why we want the spur gear to be on the closer side of the guitar body and the worm gear to be away from the guitar body. But anyway, I didn't do any pre-measuring or anything. I just went on eBay and I looked for classical guitar tuners, and I picked up the ones that I liked. And if I slip these in, they fit perfectly. So now all that's left is to screw them in. You may find that when you do this that the screw holes don't line up. Oftentimes they'll kind of overlap a little bit, but you would in those cases fill that with a toothpick or a dowel, and then drill some new holes, and it's fine. All of the holes that are going to be mounting this thing are going to be underneath that plate, and so no one's going to see it anyway. But yeah, that's how you replace the tuners. That's how you deal with broken ones, and that's how you find the ones that'll fit your guitar. So this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for watching, and check out the rest of my videos.